start. So, John Stoltenberg, thank you very much for talking with me. Let's start at the very beginning. Where and when were you born?
I was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota, June 7, 1944, to be exact. My father's ancestry was Norwegian and my mother's was German.
That new Marjorie Green committee who wants Anglo-Saxon heritage preserved would like you very much.
Well, I wrote a book called Refusing to be a Man, and I should probably follow it up with a book called Refusing to be White.
Or Anglo-Saxon. You know, what's interesting is Jack Kammer's birthday is June 11th. Mine is June 12th. Yours is June 7th. Do you identify at all with Gemini characteristics of having lots of projects and being interested in communication, multiple sides of your personality, or not?
Yes, and yes, and yes. Andrea was into astrology. Few people know this, but she really was. And so I had my horoscope done, and no, I meet all the check marks for the Gemini, for my birth sign, for the date, and so forth. I don't have a working knowledge of that, but I think I'm probably as Geminian as can be.
That's what Jack said too. Do you remember your moon and rising sign?
Oh gosh, no.
What was Andrea's sign?
I don't. Oh, Taurus. No, Libra. Excuse me.
Wait, what?
This is embarrassing.
When was her birthday?
My birthday was September 26th.
Yeah, it's Libra.
46.
Yeah, it's Libra.
Okay, this is like a pop quiz on a subject I've never studied.
Well, you're both air signs, so that makes it easier. And then you grew up in California?
No, I didn't. I grew up in Minnesota. I went to college in Minnesota, and then I began graduate work in New York City.
And I'm interested in what you've written about, that it was difficult to be a boy, and that all my life I felt different from other guys. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, I think I was having an experience that was more widely shared than I knew at the time. I thought I was the only one. I was unathletic, I was fat. I didn't realize till maybe junior high school that I probably wasn't heterosexual, and then that became clear that I wasn't. So I had a number of defects that I thought of in terms of deficiencies, and that is, I wasn't a real enough boy, and I kind of always knew that. Yeah, I was teased, I was bullied. I don't think I got it as bad as some kids today do. I don't. But I got it enough to make me feel very ashamed. And I basically threw myself into achievements to rescue myself from this sense of unworthiness as not enough of a real boy. And as the thing is, what happened later in my life when I started writing about these subjects is that I realized, wow, just about everybody who was raised to be a real boy or a real man, just about everybody has that story of, I had expectations to be a more real boy than I actually could be, or a more real man than I could be. And then there are stories of overcompensation, of course. But as I say, at the time when I was growing up, I felt very isolated about that.
Right. But you say in general that the male role is negative in some ways. It involves being dominant, putting other groups down to feel superior, looking down on women, even hating women. Do you still stand by that? Do you think that's still true?
Well, there's a bit of a semantic problem here. I know you wanted to ask me about a man's perspective, and my first question would be, well, which man? Because it's sort of like asking somebody to talk about race relations who's a white nationalist, or somebody who says, I happen to be born with this Caucasian skin, and I really want to do the right thing, and I I know I probably got some bad habits from my white culture. Help me figure out what to do. Those are two different kinds of white people. And in the same kind of analogous way, this is very simplifying it, but there are different kinds of people who you would call that's a man. There's a man who is uh, very, his identity is very dependent on putting down somebody else. He can't be who he thinks he should be without making somebody else lesser than him. And that is a classic paradigm that we see going on as individuals. We see male people bonding to do that together over and against third parties. It's a way of staying safe from each other because they pick a common patsy or person to put down on the basis of ableism or race or gender expression, or it runs the gamut. I wrote a piece called How Human Oppression Happens, or Why Human Oppression Happens, and I really trace it to this core belief that you're less than nobody if you're not a real man. Not that you're female or feminine, but you're less than nobody. It's a real kind of complete absence of identity. That is the kind of identity as a real man that many male assigned at birth people are raised to believe they have to occupy that idea. And they're actually traumatized into it. I think there are many stories of the traumatization into real boyhood and real manhood expectations that people bury and they don't want to think too much about because it's humiliating to think about when one was weak, when one was the victim. It's much better to remember oneself as the triumphant one and to hell with the victims because I'm just going to be my bully self. I think there are some male-bodied people who do escape that. They don't escape the culture that makes that identity necessary and possible and sustains it. In this piece I wrote called Why Human Oppression Happens, and I really trace it back to this idea of a manhood. I tried to find a language that was kind of not used for other things, and I talked about the alpha code, this thing that's kind of programmed into you. It doesn't come with the hardware. It has to be ingrained in you, imprinted on you through trauma. And so the idea of manhood that I think needs to be, that is very problematic, is that kind of manhood. There's another way of talking about manhood as courage and as being supportive and being
protective,
and also all things, by the way, that don't have gender associated necessarily with them. They are all things that all humans are capable of. But a lot of people call that, oh, that's manhood. Well, okay, that is manhood. It's also widely shared attributes of human beings. But there's that. So I want to be careful when I talk about manhood that I'm referring to this alpha code driven manifestation of it that is a lifelong quest to be the man there, because it's ceaseless. You have to keep repeating acts of dominance in order to sustain that belief that you are a real man by making yourself credible in the eyes of other people as a real man. So, and that's been kind of my life work, really, to articulate how manhood is an ethical construction. It is not an anatomical attribute. It is about acts and ethics. It is an identity achieved through a particular ethics of domination and superiority, derogation. It goes all the way to murder or rape. There's a range of actions that are taken in order to sustain and shore up that belief in one's manhood.
You know, it seems to me that Trump is the epitome of that negative view, and he is very popular with what's 200
No,
million
he came
people.
along, I thought, okay, object lesson number one is right there in the White House. He's exactly it, yes. No, he manifests all the bad stuff.
Do you think
All,
that in a way
including the way,
it's healing that he brings it to the surface and says this alpha male behavior is disgusting, or do you think he just perpetuates it?
I think he fuels it. I think the way in which he found a way to make public the connection between white supremacy and male supremacy, and this is another piece of my piece called which I'll send you the link to, is that the very dominant behaviors that are necessary to maintain this alpha code idea of manhood, they transfer very easily to racial superiority and to white supremacy. And in fact, the behaviors required for manhood proving and white defending they're joined at the hip ethically. And what Trump achieved was to mobilize people on that basis. He just made it right out there, transparent. You asked, is this object lesson going to be a good thing? I don't know. I think we're dealing with a lot of damage that he did. I think it's too soon to say. I think maybe just as in hindsight, we see what Hitler was, but it was hard to see what Hitler was in the middle of the Third Reich if you were in the SS. Now there's a historical view of him, although there's a lot of his Holocaust denialism, of course, but never mind that. Yes, I think maybe in 20, 50 years, it's possible. I'd like to think the country would look back at this as this epitome of the worst alpha code behavior at the highest level of governance. The most powerful person in the world was evidencing it.
Do you think that Biden's emphasis on compassion, I feel your emotions, is in some ways an antidote? Is it?
Oh, yes. And so is Kamala Harris's. The way they are in sync about emotion and empathy, I'm already just kind of verklempt thinking about how restorative that has been, and how hopeful it makes one feel that this kind of modeling of human empathy is now, we expect it. We know, we see it, we feel it, we watch it play out. And by the way, a story about Biden that I think was very interesting. You remember during the debates when Harris just kind of like took him down?
For the segregated school, integration school, yeah.
There was a moment I realized when he picked her to be his vice presidential nominee, I thought, this is a man, and now I mean man in the good way, this is a man who doesn't bear a grudge, who is not on a high horse about some vendetta about some woman who humiliated him in public. He saw her qualities. He said, we're going to make a good team. He was right. But I would love to have been a little molecule in his brain at the point that he was figuring out he had to let that go. There's no word in the English language for what that was, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
It is a letting go of all the stuff that you were trained into in terms of the dominant model of manhood. You're never supposed to be the loser.
Right.
And,
You know what interests me is that the majority of white women voted for him at least the first term. I don't know the second run. And when you hear women being interviewed, they say, I love him. I love him. So there's some kind of, women are buying into this, all the women who voted for him and who love him. What's that about? They're trained to think alpha male is sexy?
I am always reluctant to do the same kind of public analysis on women that I do on men. I don't think it's quite my place. I don't think I quite have the knowledge base. Andrea Dworkin did write a book called Right Wing Women, and she lays it all out. And in a nutshell, it's that women understand how dangerous male supremacy is in the world, and they make a deal with it for safety. They make a deal to be owned by one man and to be loyal to one man's misogyny, basically, because it's less risky than being out there in the field subject to a pack of men's misogyny. And so there's a certain kind of protection and safety that's part of the deal. That is a very loose paraphrase, and I urge anyone who wants to follow up on this to read that book. It is more prophetic than anyone knew at the time. It is the code book to Trump's female support.
Got it. Do you think, in terms of boys today, that there's any less pressure to be an alpha male? Do you think it's improved? Do they have more freedom, more options?
Well, one of the most interesting things that's happening right now, and in some circles it's very controversial, I think it's breakthrough, and that is that gender normativity is kind of blurring and dissolving before our eyes. An extraordinarily high number of people, young people, are identifying as non-binary.
A third of American teens.
And this trend is looking like it's an exponential growth. This is, I flash back to the 60s and free love and so forth, which was actually very, very gendered, very, very
sexist,
dominant and sexist. But something is afoot in this country and in, I think, the world that is making it possible for someone to live in the world and not be trapped in a gender expectation and be able to see a way out of it. I just wrote another piece called "Everyone Wants a Gender Off-Ramp," and the metaphor is that hegemonic gender is like this superhighway, and everybody is looking for the off-ramp for themselves. The off-ramps don't always necessarily go to the same place, but more and more people want to get out of there and go someplace else. And young people are really in droves showing the way. And I think it's too soon to know where this is going, but I sense in my gut that this is a really good thing. That I'm not saying that everyone's adaptation or off-ramp is the best ideal one. I don't even know what that is, but what I can see is that supportive cultures are growing up around kids who, like me, didn't feel they fit in, but they're finding ways to fit in. Of course, social media is making all of these isolated niche experiences a shared language for them, and that's pretty good. So I forget your question, but
I'm asking if it's easier for young people today, and you're saying yes.
There are more options. There are more visible and tribal options, which is really quite extraordinary. I didn't have a conversation with a gay person until I was in college. I was like completely alone in it. And now, as I say, there's tribes. I think if I were to say to them something that I think they should pay more attention to, it's that your escape from gender needs to be more about your ethics and not so much about your aesthetics. That is to say, yes, your fashion, your embodiment, all of that. Yes, I know that feels like a departure from gender expectations. It gives you a feedback loop of, I'm not trying to be a real man now. So this
Because
is
I
my
dyed my
authentic.
hair blue or
So,
green or something.
yeah, the theme of my work is no. It's actually in the ethical domain that you will be escaping the gender hierarchy, the gender hegemony, the gender templates. That is really where it happens. You can be a 6'6" burly football player and be the kindest person anybody knows. And it has nothing to do with your genetics, with your time spent in the gym, your time spent in shopping for clothes, your time spent making up. It has nothing to do with that essentially. Now, how we read each other, how we look at each other, and we see, oh, there goes somebody who's non-binary, or there goes somebody who's transitioning, or something like that. We're reading all the aesthetic signals. We're not necessarily reading the ethical information until we get to know them. And that is a fact of human life, that we first present, and everybody gets our aesthetics first. But when it comes right down to it in real life, interpersonally and relationally, it's not about the green hair, it's not about the bicep, it's about fairness, equity, respect, and empathy, and all of that.
What I see, I have a grandson who's 10, and what I see among his friends is they don't think girls have cooties like when I was growing up. The boys and girls were pretty separate in their play groups, but them, they don't separate like that, and they don't think that one sex is better than the other or have cooties. So that seems encouraging to me.
I think that is an important trend. I don't know how widespread it is, but I know that it's happening. I know that there are a lot of kids who've been raised in educational systems and in families where there's more, I think it's called non-gender specific toys and games and activities and so forth. There's much more acceptance about that. There's more recognition of it. And, we've watched a generation of girls come up through playing soccer. In my generation, girls didn't do that. And then there came along this generation, and they were athletes. Oh my gosh. And that completely changed the physicality of female people in space, in life. So, yeah, I think there are some really good things happening about breaking down gender barriers and eroding the archetypal information that has been part of male supremacist culture for eons, about what you have to do to be a man, and what you have to do, who you have to be a woman, and what you have to expect a man to do to you, and how you are supposed to be beheld by a man to be a woman. All those rules, they're crumbling, and that's good. By the way, in a parallel universe, they're also, the wagons are circling. There's a rigor mortis of reaffirmation of gender hierarchy that's been on the right, on the alt-right, for some time. And these things are happening at the same time, these two trends.
That always happens. You make advances and there's backlash. You make advances and there's backlash, like Susan Faluti's book about backlash. I'm wondering, I did a book called Women's Culture, the Women's Renaissance of the 70s, and then an update book. And among those creative women, there's kind of a woman is wonderful school, that women are in tune with nature. they have cycles like the earth, they give birth like the earth. And I did a recent book this year called Climate Girls Saving Our World, interviews with young women climate activists, and they did the same thing. That I asked, why are so many girls in the forefront of the climate movement? And they said, women are in touch with the earth, they have these kind of affinities. So it was the same, what I call Woman is Wonderful school. And I wondered if that's a danger of saying men's role, the alpha role, is dangerous, so therefore women are somehow better?
Well, this is a complicated subject, and again, I'm going to kind of cite Andrea on it, because she wrote an extraordinary piece called Biological Determinism, the World's Most Deadly and Dangerous Idea. And she was specifically addressing, I think, in some sense, that she was speaking to an audience where that woman is wonderful idea had kind of translated into a kind of separatism and a better than men school of thought. I also want to say that I think cultures that affirm marginalized and dominated peoples are important. I would never say there should not be a culture of support and affirmation for anyone who's on the receiving end of dominance and superiority. I would never say that. And so in that sense, it is on a personal level, it is a kind of salvation. Is it a political solution? I'm not sure. I wouldn't go so far as to say that. I mean, I think the political solutions needed have to be much more focused on the dominance and decoding it and disempowering it. It was one of the reasons, by the way, I think Andrea and Catherine McKinnon understood that they had to take on pornography as a system of harm and empower people harmed by it to fight back. That's a big subject. That's that story of that work that they did. But it was about identifying the centrality of pornography in creating the world in which women are raped and brutalized in their homes. And in that sense, they were quite prescient. I mean, I don't think anyone raising a kid right now and worrying about how much access they have to online sadism would disagree that there's a cultural force going on there that it's hard to imagine it's being stoppable at this point. But no amount of woman is good will be a shield against the incursion on a life that is incited by violent pornography. It just won't save you.
I think in those, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in the porn, they show women as liking being raped or grabbed or assaulted, that the women are really turned on by it. Is that part of the genre?
Yeah, in a lot of it, I think there's a quote of Andrews, the smile on her face is the only thing that's false in it, because everything else that's happening to her is really happening to her. It is the only fiction in it. And simultaneously there are niche markets for pornography where she has to be seen suffering for it to be gratifying. I mean, nobody has yet figured out all the styles of pornographic consumption that are possible today, but there's a bunch. There's quite a bunch.
It makes a lot of money. So
Yeah.
it's really thriving business, which is sad.
And one of the things that the internet has done is made niches more monetizable. When pornography was VHS or print magazines, um, I mean, if three people were into something, there wasn't a magazine for them. But now, if three people are into something, they can find each other on the web and create a whole cult around a particular degrading practice. And violent and degrading practices are spreading. Choking, for instance, was not a thing decades ago. It is now a thing. And it's entirely something that was taught and learned through pornography.
So the idea is that part of your sexual process is the woman gets choked almost to death?
Yeah, to orgasm.
Oh, for the man's orgasm.
Yeah, and it's ostensibly for her too. I mean, it's almost gone mainstream now. I mean, there's a film out called oh gosh, it's up for a nominee for an Oscar, Something Woman. Anyway, it's got a scene in it that features choking.
Oh.
Do you know the film I'm talking about?
Yeah, I do, but I don't remember the name either. But it's like a real something. I know we can put it in the text box and.
Anyway, my point is that pornography is a precursor and a driver of behaviors that are all part of this ethic of degrade, dominate, dismiss, Do
you as a radical feminist believe that sex roles, gender roles are socially constructed? You say that they're myths, and Andrea says they're myths. But what about the role of hormones? Because what I'm thinking of is my grandson with his 10-year-old boyfriends. Their talk, their play is all about hierarchies of power, who has this magical power or weapon. And when he's with his girlfriend, like they talk about, oh, we're going to start a store in her backyard and we're going to get engaged and get married when we're older. They're really different. And, it really seems like testosterone and estrogen have an impact on our behavior. So how do you combine the thought of roles with our bodies, with our hormones?
Well, I don't deny that we have physicality, and we're embodied people, and we come in all sorts, and we come with various extents of this and that in us. It's one thing, though, to have, let's say, for example, testosterone is a precursor of a certain kind of energy and athleticism and strength and exuberance or whatever, or just kind of like, okay, so what do you do with that? That's where it becomes an ethical question. Does that energy turn into aggression? Or does it turn into a certain kind of ardor for a physical challenge that could be exhausting but good? It's like, and nobody gets hurt. I did a media campaign. It was a sexual assault prevention media campaign on the theme line, "My strength is not for hurting." I tried to speak to that. Okay, let's say embodied strength is something that comes with the plumbing, as it were, in male-bodied people. Let's say that. What's it for? Is it for hurting or not? And I said, let's position strength as a good thing. No one's going to say you got to be weak or you got to toss your strength. But what's it for? How do you use it? My strength is not for hurting. And I developed an entire media campaign centrally around consent. That was then picked up by the Department of Defense, and the military spread it around the world with a slight shift in the language, because my strength is not for hurting didn't quite compute to the military world, because they do hurt. But it turned into my strength is for defending. And its tagline was preventing sexual assault is part of my duty. It was locating it in that sense of duty that the military people are trained to abide by.
Honor.
And it was very well received. And anyway, that's my answer about hormones, because the hormone question goes to the question of physical strength, and then that goes to the question of, yeah, but how do you use it? If you can, and how do you use that energy? If you use it only to reiterate your dominant idea of manhood over and against somebody else, well, that's a pretty poor use of it, but that's how it's used a lot. And yeah, hormones are in that, but hormones are also in other kinds of heroism.
The movie is Promising Young Woman.
Thank you. It's an amazingly, it's a revenge movie, kind of feminist, kind of thriller. But yes, the end scene is okay, spoiler. Yeah.
Okay. I interviewed a trans man for my Happy Marriage book, because I wanted different kinds of marriages. And he said that taking testosterone, the main thing that changed for him was his visual turn-ons. Before, he'd see a beautiful body, and I was like, oh yeah, that's a beautiful body. But with testosterone, it was like, breasts. You know, there was more of a visual, visceral reaction to, in his case, a female body. So I think I don't think it's fair to say all gender roles are socially constructed or myths if some of them are influenced by estrogen or testosterone.
No, I wouldn't go so far as to say that. I would say that the gender identity real man is problematic, because the only way you get to that is with an ethic of derogation and degradation and dominance. It is the only way it works, and it works because the alternative is non-entity. The alternative, if you're traumatized into belief that that's who you gotta be, the alternative is a kind of annihilation.
It's interesting to me that they say that in male prisons, the organizational system is gangs with hierarchies, and in women's prisons, they form family groups. And so that was interesting to me in terms of kind of male-female approaches.
You know, that can be, I personally, I find a lot of these sex differentiation theories and studies and findings really a way of kind of staying comfortable in a binary world.
Interesting.
And the fact is that a lot of people want to escape that. And there's the scientific world has been built on maintaining those gender archetypes, that polarity, and with it the implicit approval for male supremacy. So I think it's okay to observe these things, but I think it's also important to remember and to recall that in a world where gender is such a fraught, gender identity is so fraught. It's like, for those who are into this alpha code manhood proving. It's do or die. And the world that is constructed to keep them dominant, those people, is a very dangerous place. There's so much oppression that's required societally to keep those identities sacrosanct and secure. And that has to be constantly interrogated. And we kind of lose sight of that when we're looking at these kind of like interesting studies of, is the, hormone stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Because the truth is, it's this huge spectrum, all of it. And I don't even particularly care for the spectrum metaphor. My
That was
preferred one
Kinsey, that we all are on a spectrum in terms of our sexual orientation.
Yeah. People kind of think of overlapping spectrums and, layers of spectrums. I actually think our sense of our gender is much more like a point on a color wheel. You might feel a little more blue one day, or a little more red one day, or a little yellow one day. And in fact, gender awareness of oneself can migrate over life. I mean, some people, it changes over a lifetime. It isn't, sometimes it's dramatic in people who transition, but it's much more, we're all gender fluid more than we like to remember.
How has it changed for you, your gender over time, your fluidity, if it has?
Yeah, I just don't ever think about whether I'm presenting enough as a man. I don't think I'm read as anything but it doesn't, how there's some people who are male-bodied who like talk at the bottom of their vocal range all the time until they get so gruff their vocal cords kind of give up? They're like terrified of their upper register. I'm just using that as a model of what it means to be in constant panic about whether you're presenting as male enough. And it issues forth in a lot of people, male-bodied people, as this kind of, I've got to talk down here, or, and so when you find someone whose whole vocal range is available to them, and it's like kind of like, oh, you're at ease, because it's like they're not working at it so hard, That's kind of like an emblem. It's not the whole story of my own retreat from, salvation from gender panic. The big turning point came for me, as I've written in several places, when I read in Andrea's book that man and woman are social constructions and they don't really exist. And there was a kind of freedom that came from, oh my God, the cookie cutter I was trying to fit into, it's not real. It's a made up thing. And I thereafter found it was possible to be who I be without constantly thinking about, am I coming off male enough? I know where I shop for clothes. I know the department I go to because it fits my body. But I'm not walking around alarmed that I'm some kind of imposter, some gender imposter. And I think a lot of folks are.
A tiny example of that is I'm a feminist. I raised a son as a feminist, and my 10-year-old grandson, his dad told him, don't wear pink. So I gave him something with pink. He said, oh no, I can't wear this. And that's today. That amazed me.
Yeah, that's changing too, by the way. See, there's a coding to confirm our delusion. that we're bipolar binary species, and we're not.
Interesting. So, in terms of you and Andrea living together for 31 years and both being pretty free of stereotypical roles, how did you do the roommate issues of cooking and cleaning and bill paying, and how did you keep from falling back into traditional roles?
Oh gosh. So you just sent me down memory lane, and give me a moment. I mean, we did divvy up tasks, but not along gender lines. There were things that were her job and mine, and ours. We had both been married before. She to a man who really abused her. And she's written a lot about that, the Dutch anarchist. And I mean, she was a battered wife for several years. But we both came out, we had both been married before, and we both knew in ourselves the worst traits that came out in ourselves in being in a marriage. I mean, the things that I look with horror back on my first marriage in terms of the things I did to be the husbandly things to do. I remember, to my shame, putting a sticky note on the refrigerator, and it said, "Clean me." That was then.
That was to your wife?
Say again?
That was for your wife?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's just a thing that keeps recurring to me, as how the worst traits that came out in me trying to be a proper husband. And so we both were recoiling from that in ourselves. She was in recoil from the masochism of being, the obedient wife. And I mean, I was never a violent husband, but I was what can I say? I came with all the pomp and circumstance of it.
Not controlling.
No. But not at all thinking of it in terms of an equilibrium of equality and equity and empathy. Because we were both in the same game playing world. We were playing the same game, just the different parts of it. So with Andrea, that was not ever in front of us. That's not to say I never did anything that was my old behaviors coming through again. That would be false. In the 31 years, well, we began having a conversation, and it was really about a conversation that never wanted to end. I mean, we first met having a conversation. We knew each other from the same circles, but
you both left a poetry reading because it was sexist and met outside. Yeah.
And at the time, she had been asked to write a story for publication about a man who was in jail who had either murdered women or beaten women, forget. And she was in a lot of conflict because it was an assignment she needed the money, she'd have to go interview him, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. And everybody she talked to was telling her, do it. And she and I started talking about it, and I realized, why do it? I understood why she wouldn't want to. And I was probably the first person to affirm that, which began our conversation. And it was a conversation that, I mean, I tell people this a lot. She came to know me better than I knew myself, and I came to count on that.
And what aspect of the relationship was influenced by both of you identifying as queer?
What was the absence of heterosexuality? Probably. I mean, it just wasn't in us or between us, or in our lives in any way. I mean, I don't know if that makes sense, but like, in what sense were we both? I mean, she identified as lesbian and I identified as gay. Sometimes I called myself queer. I'm not sure queer was quite the word then than it is now.
Yeah.
But, I mean, we fit the word queer. I mean, she did almost none of the things that women do to present themselves to the world as feminine. I mean, like, I think she wore one earring. That was it. But so did I.
That's great.
So, gosh, I think I'm really just getting lost in memories here, and it's hard to focus on exactly what is the question I'm supposed to be answering right now. So pull me back, because it's nice for me to remember, but I'm getting lost, you know?
Well, were you free to have same-sex relationships outside of the marriage, or was that...
Yes.
So your commitment was to be best friends, people who loved each other, married, but you could have other kinds of relationships outside.
Yeah, I'm going to speak only for myself, not for her, but yeah, I mean, the understanding was no lies, no secrets, but the unfaithfulness was not in the sex with somebody else. The unfaithfulness was in the deceit, or the, you see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. How does one keep from being bored or lose interest over 31 years with the same person? How do you keep it interesting and vital and alive and want to stay in it?
Well, I'm making it sound like there were no times in the day when we didn't have anything to say to each other, and that's not true, because we did have quiet times. I mean, in our situation, it was a lot of stuff from the outside that would just kind of like come into our lives and need dealing with, you know? It was somebody wrote something and published something, or somebody turned down something, or somebody... There was an assault or an attack. I mean, we lived, because so much came into our lives about the politics outside through her work primarily. There was all of that happening, and stuff to talk about that was happening outside that we both either were both alarmed about or distressed about, or I mean, I will say that she's written about this pretty vividly. There was a very dark time, and it happened after her drug rape in Paris in 1999. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Mm-mm.
She had just finished work on her magnum opus, Scapegoat, Women and the Jews and Women's Liberation. It took her like 9 years, and it's massively footnoted and researched. And she needed a holiday, and she said, I want to go to Paris. And she went to Paris and stayed in a pretty good hotel where she was drug raped.
Oh.
And she called me right after, and I said, come home, get the first plane home. And I've written about this. She wrote about it in an essay called My Suicide, that she kept on her computer without showing anyone, and I discovered it on her computer after she died. And she tells the story, and it's a beautifully written piece. If beautifully is the word, but I mean, it's so literary. It's in the form of a suicide note. It's a literary suicide note. And I read it and had to put it away. I couldn't bear it. Years later, I looked at it again and saw potential in it to bring the words there to other people in the form of a theater piece. And as it happens, that theater piece was produced in Montreal, and that production is now online. You can see an actor performing for 90 minutes Andrew's words about her drug rape. And remind me to send you that link too. What neither of us understood was how a rape impacts the relationship.
Oh.
Nobody knows to talk about that. And it's something I've not even wrapped my head around, but there was a year or so there when it was very, very hard. She was, the aftermath of the rape was traumatic for her. It lasted and lasted a long time. I'm not sure it ever left her, but I mean, by the time her last years of life, I mean, there was joy again. But there was a while there where she was in very bad shape, and I didn't know how to be there for her.
Yeah, you can't take away the incident.
Utterly powerless. But nobody was there saying, John, what you need to know is this. This is what she's going through. You need to be open to. No, I had no counseling. I had no advice, no information. Nobody writes the book, What to Do When Your Loved One is Raped. Nobody has written that book.
But in hindsight, would you say the solution is offer to be there for them and let them lead, or what would you say in hindsight, what to do if your partner is raped?
Well, in our case, it was very complicated by the fact that it was a drug rape, and she kept searching her memory for it. I mean, all the evidence was the evidence was circumstantial, but she, who knew a lot about sexual violence, turns out didn't know anything about drug rape. And it took her a while to talk to a rape counselor friend who told her, this is what you need to know. These are the symptoms. These are the sequelae. These are the things that drug rape survivors go through. And it was only in that conversation that it began to be clear what she was going through. Because there are apparently patterns of symptoms, but neither of us knew it. We were both ignorant. So I'm saying that it wasn't apparent, because there was this huge missing piece of it, which was that it happened while she blacked out.
Yeah.
From a drug and a drink.
Right. When you had conflict situations, did you have ways to work it out when you had conflicts that other people could learn from? Disagreements?
Well, we did work it out. Sometimes sooner than later, or later than sooner. I mean, and that is one of the. I mean, the loss of her was huge. But I'm very grateful that the last couple of years were very good years. She had many health problems. We moved to DC about. It would have been about a year and a half before she died. So there was a year and a half that we lived here in DC, and it was good. The medical issues notwithstanding, it was a very happy life again. And it was like coming through a really dark time.
So it really makes you appreciate the connection.
And obviously we had a lot to work out about the move, and because I got a job here, that's what happened. That's why we moved. And we worked like a good team figuring that one out, and it was a massive job.
So your way of dealing with disagreements was to talk it through, or what?
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about your books. Just kind of, if people want to see how your thinking has progressed. I think your first one was Disarmament and Masculinity.
No, actually, it was Refusing to be a Man. Disarmament and Masculinity is an essay in that book.
Okay. So, is there anything about refusing to be a man, the themes that we haven't discussed?
Well, broadly speaking, it's a philosophical book, although it's mostly speeches delivered orally. But the scope of it is a kind of a philosophical grounding for what became the ethical approach that I started working out in the sequel to it called The End of Manhood, which is more practical. It's more like a self-help book. So there's this philosophical book, and then there's this practical self-help type book, and they're very connected. They're kind of in a conversation with each other. To the extent that my thinking has moved beyond that, it's taken into account much more about gender diversity and how that plays out in many people's lives. And I've also more recently become kind of outspoken as a radical feminist who's trans inclusive rather than a radical feminist who's trans exclusive. That, as you know, is a huge schism in radical feminism. It's fair to say that. I don't know that it'll ever be mended, but I'm clear about what side I'm on. And so I've been working to incorporate into that argument a lot of what I learned writing those two books. There's nothing I would go back on in those two books. I mean, there's nothing I said that I would unsay. They're still read.
I'm thinking of your master's degree from Union Theological Seminary, that's kind of the foundation for your emphasis on a moral approach to thinking about gender. But why did you want to get that divinity degree?
Well, I was a philosophy major in college with an emphasis on English too, and theater. I did a lot of theater. So there was something about theater and philosophy that was really taking hold in my brain. And I was pretty captivated by Kierkegaard. This was a Lutheran college. And I got to seminary because I had a fellowship that would take me there. That's what happened. I didn't plan to go to seminary. I was never going to be ordained. But I got this fellowship that would take me for a trial year. I got there and I stayed. And it was an interesting fit because I found the philosophy of religion really interesting. I got involved in theater with a theological spin to it. I was a playwright then, and I wrote but to get to the core of your question, the relationship between the ethics of acts and how it informed my understanding of gender is very deeply related to my love of theater, which I still think of as the art form that is most conducive to expressing issues of ethics in interpersonal relations.
Like the Greeks. Like the Greeks.
Sorry?
Like Greek theater,
Yes,
you know,
exactly.
our ancient Greek
Oh yeah,
traditions.
they started it.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't do ethics with a sculpture. You know, you can do many wonderful things with sculpture, but you can't do ethics or theological fine points. You know, but in drama that happens, and I studied systematic ethics in seminary. I got a brain loaded up with a lot of stuff about ethics from a religious point of view, and I just take it secular because that's what I do. It carries over secularly really well for me. There's nothing I feel I'm missing by not having some transcendent being playing in the stories I find ethically illuminating. In fact, the most influential book maybe that I ever read was a book called Honest to God by a man named Bishop John Robinson. He was a bishop, I think, Episcopal. And he posited that God is not out there, but God is between. God's between us. Like just between you and me right now could be God. And that was a mind-blowing breakthrough for me. And I still think that's the truth.
It's kind of like quantum physics.
Yeah.
It's about the interconnection between everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's an example in the End of Manhood of a how-to that we haven't talked about?
I talk about lovemaking in a way that doesn't mean asserting oneself as the man there, which is different from being somebody who's full of ardor and energy and erotic passion. But when you're erotically with somebody and you're feeling their feeling as well as your own, it's a different zone of eroticism, which doesn't mean it has to be any less ardent or passionate or even energetic and all of that, or orgasmic. Andrea has a chapter in her book Intercourse called Communion. And she writes about, she's got it's a book with 8 chapters, and each chapter takes on a dimension of intercourse. And in this particular chapter, she takes on the dimension of communion, where 2 people actually meet, not one person does something to the other. So I do remember having a chapter or so about that as an example of what it would mean to, as I put it in the foreword, love justice more than manhood. I basically, that's the maxim of the book. The core of one's being must love justice more than manhood. and by manhood there I mean that paradigm of dominance. If you love justice more, if you want to embody and inhabit justice more, you really do have to leave off your loyalty to that kind of manhood. You just have to let it go.
Yeah, it's a burden. Is What Makes Pornography Sexy, that's a book?
It is a book. It's actually a guide to doing a workshop with some analysis and explication. It started with a workshop that I created called the Pose Workshop. It was in the era of Playboys and Penthouses and other print magazines, and I would bring in magazines and show pictures from the magazines and have men replicate the pose in the magazine and have the other men in the circle watch.
The poses that women were in.
The pose that women were in the photograph in the print magazine. I don't think the workshop translates to internet porn right very well, but in those days, it was a really mind-changing moment about recognizing what her subordination meant physically to inhabit it, to mimic it, to mirror it, for that to appear as sexy, in air quotes. And so that was the big takeaway lesson of the pose workshop. I did it for a long time in lots of different circumstances, and at a certain point decided I can't do this anymore. I'm just going to write a book about how someone else can do it, and so that's what I did.
I'm thinking of Jean Kilbourne's slideshows of ads and a lot of women doing kind of oral sex things with things that aren't human. they're yeah. So I can imagine. I'm really interested in your 2013 fiction, your utopian novel Gonerz. How do you pronounce it?
Gonerz, like the word Gonerz, but with a Z.
And tell us about that. It's utopian, not dystopian.
It is dystopian in a way. It's about a dystopian future, but it's about a utopian group of kids. It's four characters. They're 13 going on 12 going on 13, I think. And they live together in a quarantine space to be pure breeders because there's this malignant virus that's taken over the world. And people are dying in droves. And so the government sets up breeding farms.
Like the Nazis did.
Yeah. And they select 4 kids. 2 are called loomers and 2 are called spermers. That is, they're brought together because of their reproductive capacity, and they're just put into a home together to live together. And this novel is told by one of the 4 in this particular housing unit. And it's their story and their adventures and their loves and their I feel it's the best thing I've ever written. It kind of counts as a young adult novel, but it's just way too sexually explicit for that, probably. But it was I conceived it during the AIDS crisis. I can remember exactly the moment it came to me. Andrea and I were in this coffee shop around the corner, and I took out a little napkin and I started writing a few things. And it was the genesis of this idea of kids surviving against a cataclysmic crisis of infection out there, just a pandemic beyond anything. And what would it be like for them? What would the government be doing to get them to breed? What films would the government be showing them to show them how to, conceive? What if there were pawns in a governmental plan to repopulate the country after everybody had died off? So anyway, that was it. It's also written in a very kind of like invented teenage slang. So.
Did you read Marge Piercy's old novel, Woman on the Edge of Time?
I did not. I'm sorry to say.
It would be interesting because she creates a world where there's nothing, no behaviors based on gender, nothing.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of cool. That is, they're inventing it themselves as they go along. They're all polyamorous. That is to say, okay, I'm going to talk conventional language. 2 males, 2 females. That's not how they call themselves. That's not how they think of themselves. But each of them is lovers with one other. So there's always one of the 4 that they're not lovers with. But each of the picture a quadrant, and each has pretty deep love relationships, sexual relationships with 2 others in the quadrant. Anyway, so they are polyamorous in that way, but very loyal to each other and to their community, their home, their family.
Piercy's book, they're polyamorous too.
Say again?
In Piercy's book, they're polyamorous too.
Yeah. It's not that they're not. There's anatomical sex differentiation. I mean, and they have their own slang for it. The spermer's genital is called a wanger. They make up stuff because nobody teaches them. They make it up from old TV shows that are being beamed into them.
That's funny.
So yeah, I mean, it's beyond gender in the ethical sense. It isn't absent gender in the anatomical sense. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's life. Do you have a next book that's brewing in the brain cells up there?
Yeah, I've been trying to put together a collection that would be I just call it Refusing to be a Man 2, or Son of Refusing. Another anthology, because I've done a lot of short pieces that kind of haven't all had a home together, and I'm kind of cobbling that one together.
What about something like Being a Man Plus, or something?
Yeah, I don't know what it's called. I don't know.
Okay. You said that we need a revolution in terms of capitalism and gender. So since you said that, do you see any revolutionary signs of change?
Well, that just reminds me. I just read a book called White Feminism, which I recommend. And she's very illuminating on the subject of how a faux feminism has been adopted by the marketplace, by capitalism, and made into a marketing tool that doesn't change anything. And that's still rolling around in my mind about how the extent to which a liberal feminist individualism kind of buying into a lot of pornographization of people, self-pornographization, how that has become monetizable, and it's kind of distressing.
There's a British author who has a fairly new book out about false feminism and advertising. I don't remember the exact title, but I'll send you the link.
So what's on my mind in terms of that right now is the way in which capitalism has cashed in on what looks like feminism, but has left intact everything about sexual assault, everything about pornography, everything about the traumatization that goes into um, inculcating manhood into penis people.
Mm.
It's untouched by that. Um, I mean, a similar case can be made, I think, for the way in which capitalism has appropriated diversity and done a kind of a Benetton look on everything without any structural changes.
You know, I think that romanticization of women can do everything, should look great, have a big career, make baby food, that part of that pressure is the reason that teenagers around the world report more anxiety and depression, and girls are more likely to report it. And it could just be that they're more able to speak their anxiety and depression. But I do think that creates a tremendous amount of pressure to be all this that the fake feminism shows in media.
Yes, I think it's terrible on kids. It appears to be sending the message girls can be anything.
And should be.
And should be. A very important message. But it comes with all these caveats, you know?
But you should be sexy and have a nice husband. And,
yeah.
Do you think that girls are more likely to be labeled depressed and anxious because they are, or because boys aren't given permission to say, I feel sad?
Well, I think boys get the social permission to vent it in anger and violence that girls don't. I mean, I looked at the Atlanta shooter and I read a bit about his life and I realized, oh my God, that kid. There was no chance for him in terms of the notion he grew up with about sex and selfhood. I mean, he just...
he was raised a fundamentalist?
Yeah, he tried to turn off his computer to keep himself from watching porn. Then he tried to kill the women he went to service him, to stop him from being serviced by them. I mean, he was a mess. And that's not to take away from the anti-Asian climate in which it occurred and the anti-Asian themes in it. But there's a reason that our serial killers are mostly cis white men.
And school shooters and...
Yeah. Girls punish themselves. Boys have ways to punish others.
Interesting. Wow.
And it's the same sickness that they're trying to escape, but it's gendered.
Right. So, to end, is there anything other message that you would like to convey that we haven't discussed in terms of how to break out of these gender stereotypes and locks?
Yeah, actions matter. Interactions matter. Pay attention to how you are behaving in relationship to other people. You're talking and listening. Your actions. What you do in front of your kids, not just what you say. Actions are the and implicit in that I mean ethics. The ethics in actions. That is the lingua franca, the common language that we have to learn how to speak to reach into each other's lives without hurting and to reach in with love.
And, it's interesting because Jesus said all that, 2,000 years ago, and he never made any distinctions based on gender.
Didn't. In fact, he was quite a renegade in the sense that he didn't buy into the culture's despisal prostituted woman.
And he healed a woman with the issue of blood, talked about theology with women, what you weren't supposed to do. They were there with him at the crucifixion and the resurrection.
Yeah, they just didn't get to write any of the Gospels, which is...
Or revise them years
Huh?
later. Or revise them years later.
A gospel from one of those women had been interesting.
Well, they have the Gospel of Mary, but I'm not sure what's in it. I know it's one of the apocryphal Gospels.
Yeah, there are some apocryphal, and you're right. Even if they did exist, the early church fathers would have made sure that they got outside the canon, or if they would just be purged. So anyway, but yes, to affirm what you just said. Yeah, I'm not talking about an ethic far removed from love your neighbor as yourself. Mm-mm.
And that doesn't think in terms of a gender spectrum all the time.
Right. And by the way, that core of his ethics is, you can find it in lots of religious faiths.
The golden rule is in all religions.
Yeah. And it should be more present in our daily lives.
Especially among people who profess to be religious.
Yeah.
Okay, on that note, thank you.